If you jump out of an airplane and realize it was a bad idea, you don't refuse to pull the ripcord to correct the problem, which is exactly what the United States did in the Vietnam War. I arrived in Vietnam during the 5th month of 1968. A short time later, the North Vietnamese army shot at me with an anti-aircraft gun as I sat on the floor of a helicopter with my feet hanging out. The counter-guerrilla war I had been intensely training to fight for the past 2 years was over. It had ended in the previous 4 months. Some of the local Viet Cong farmers by day, fighters by night, were still employing booby traps, punji stakes, and ambushes, but the highly effective Viet Cong main force units, the army the Americans and South Vietnamese had been trying to search and destroy for years, had in fact been destroyed, mostly by its own doing. What was left of the North Vietnamese reunification effort was the People's Army of Vietnam, the army we called the NVA. It was a conventional army made up of divisions, regiments, and maneuver battalions that was charged with taking and holding ground with brute force. The same kind of army we had been staring down in Eastern Europe since World War II. We knew where it was. We knew how to kill it. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh and his generals braced for the attack that would undo a decade of planning, toil, and sacrifice. The attack that, although it would never end their reunification efforts, would nonetheless set those efforts back years. In Washington, D.C., the much-talked-about light at the end of the tunnel shone so brightly, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara hid from its glare. On the 8th day of March 1965, the first major U.S. ground combat unit was deployed to Vietnam. 3,500 Marines from the 9th Expeditionary Brigade landed in Da Nang. Because of its proximity to North Vietnam, this section of the country was considered the most vulnerable. And indeed, during the course of the war, 54% of all Americans killed in action would die in the foremost northern provinces, an area not much bigger than the state of Connecticut. As U.S. troop strength surged to 185,000 by the end of the year, U.S. commanders concerned themselves with North Vietnamese infiltration across the demilitarized zone. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara proposed a barrier system made up of strong points and electronic sensors to monitor and interdict the encroachments. The idea was not without precedent. In the 17th century, Vietnam had been divided between two dynasties. The Nguyen in the south had built two massive walls only 60 miles north of the current DMZ. In 7 major campaigns that lasted over 150 years, the Trinh armies from the north never succeeded in breaking through both of these barriers. The military was skeptical. The lessons learned from the German blitzkrieg over, around, and through France's Maginot Line during World War II led them to favor a mobile strategy. McNamara, of course, prevailed. His ideas were in keeping with what had become an American tradition: never accept Plan A if a more expensive Plan B is on the table. The much-maligned McNamara Line would be built. The terrain south of the DMZ consists of lowlands in the east and steep mountains that extend above 2,500 feet in the west. From an engineering standpoint, securing the area was not a great challenge because the entire distance from the Gulf to Laos is only 45 miles. The McNamara Line project was authorized in January of 1967. The hard points consisted of upgrades to previously established bases. The Dong Ha Combat Base at the intersection of Route 1 and Route 9, a logistics center serviced by road, air, and inland port, was the anchor. 7 miles west was the combat base at the Cam Lo Refugee Center. A dozen miles north lie the Jiolin Fire Base and Con Tien. Con Tien, originally opened as a Special Forces A camp, was turned over to the 9th Marines in July. The bases formed the four corners of Leatherneck Square. It was the scene of some of the most vicious fighting of the war, due to its proximity to the DMZ and the North's ability to transport logistics into the area. 5 miles west was Camp Carroll, fortified by 80 artillery pieces, including several 175mm guns with a range of 20 miles. It provided fire support for the area. Continuing west for 6 miles, the rock pile was a solitary hill, 800 feet high, accessible only by helicopter and protected by artillery. It provided area observation and electronic surveillance. A dozen miles southwest of the rock pile was Khe Sanh, opened as a Special Forces A camp in 1962. Khe Sanh became a major Marine combat base by the end of 1966. It was augmented by a forward operating base of MACV-SOG, the only American troops authorized to perform combat operations in Laos. The A camp was relocated to Ligne Morice, closer to the Laotian border. By the spring of 1967, with the Americans' relentless march to the west, warning lights were going off in the small Laotian village of Khe Sanh. After the Japanese occupation of World War II, the French returned to their colonies in Indochina. The Vietnamese engaged them in a war for independence and defeated the French at a cost of 200,000 lives in 1954. The following Geneva Convention declared Vietnam independence and partitioned the country at the 17th parallel, calling for a reunification election 2 years later. When the election was canceled, the North Vietnamese set about reuniting the nation by military force. Planning began in earnest a year later as the National Liberation Front organized an army in the South. Agreements were made with China and the Soviets to procure military equipment. The first challenge the North faced was how to transport the weapons and ammunition to the front. Moving them across the demilitarized zone and down the coastal plain would create a supply line that could be easily interdicted, especially if the South received the anticipated American support. For the solution, the North looked to the rugged jungle mountains of the sparsely populated panhandle of Laos. In 1959, North Vietnam began sending troops and moving supplies into southern Laos, at first by porters, then by bicycle. Hidden from air observation by thick jungle, thousands of workers carved roads through the mountainsides. By the beginning of 1967, relays of trucks were delivering 100 tons of weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies daily to their southern base areas through the Magia Pass and the Ban Karai Pass. Full divisions of NVA troops moved south over the Ben Raving Pass closer to the DMZ. Men and material merged at the small Laotian town of Khe Sanh. Occupied in 1960, Khe Sanh was the headquarters of the 559th Transportation Group, charged with overseeing the massive logistics system that had become known to the Americans as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. By the spring of 1967, American intervention in Laos was minimal. The sensors and listening devices that were seeded to detect ground movement as part of the McNamara Line had failed. The North Vietnamese considered the random bombing campaign an annoyance of much less concern than the casualties sustained on the trail from malaria and injuries. The introduction of American-led commando units from MACV-SOG was a problem for which the North Vietnamese were still seeking a solution. Early on, they had learned that encounters with these units led to disproportionate casualties, not only from the commandos, but also from the air power they had at their disposal. A secondary problem was that, despite orders to the contrary, the young NVA soldiers found the urge to shoot at SOG's low-flying helicopters irresistible, which led to casualties from airstrikes. In the South, the National Liberation Front had developed intelligence of a U.S. plan to invade Laos and cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The early version of what would become Westmoreland's Op Plan El Paso detailed the line of attack, including an ARVN Ranger airborne assault southwest of Khe Sanh and the securing of Route 9 from Khe Sanh past Khe Sanh to the vast Savannah-Ket Plain, which is unsuitable for truck traffic because it offered little concealment from air attack. Other details included the reconditioning of abandoned airfields in Laos and the logistics requirements for the operation. The information set off a great debate in Hanoi, with the front arguing that the introduction of hundreds of thousands of American troops and the fortifications of Route 9 below the DMZ was clear evidence that the enemy planned to cut the supply lines in Laos, which would eliminate their ability to pursue the fight for reunification. They argued that it was time for the North Vietnamese army to join the fight in earnest, and with the Viet Cong main forces attack the cities in the south. They believed the South Vietnamese army would offer little resistance, and seeing their weakness, the people would rally to their side, making America's position in the war untenable. The North Vietnamese army generals, on the other hand, pointed to articles in the American press that indicated Westmoreland's request for additional troops had been turned down. They conceded that the U.S. had the resources to disrupt their supply lines, but they didn't believe they were willing to absorb the casualties required to succeed. The argument waged for months in Hanoi and became bitter, with leaders on both sides putting their careers on the line. Finally, in late summer, the Pilot Bureau sided with the front. With agreement from the Chinese, rail shipments of weapons and ammunition were greatly increased. During the last quarter of 1967, the amount of supplies flowing into southern Laos doubled, then tripled. On January 1, 1968, regiments of the North Vietnamese Army began to move from Laos into South Vietnam. On January 21st, the siege of Khe Sanh began. 10 days later, during the truce celebrating the Lunar New Year, over 100 cities and provincial capitals were attacked in South Vietnam. With many of the South's forces on leave, they initially reeled from the attacks. However, often within hours, they quickly responded. From the South Vietnamese army to the local militias to the police, resistance stiffened. Notably, soldiers from the Civilian Irregular Defense Force, led by U.S. Army Special Forces, valiantly filled the gaps in many areas. The Viet Cong main force units were largely defeated across the country by the second week of February as mop-up operations began. The battle for Hue drug on for another month and ended with the communist defeat. The victory belonged to the South Vietnamese forces, who bore the brunt of the fighting. The National Liberation Front had mistakenly judged the South Vietnamese army that had displayed little enthusiasm for fighting in the rural countryside. By 1968, the cities of South Vietnam were awash in American money. As evidence, the monthly sales of Honda Super Cubs increased from hundreds to thousands. The South Vietnamese, like people everywhere, didn't fight for their government or ideology. They fought for their family, their neighbors, and they fought for their stuff. The Viet Cong main force units that had attacked the cities were decimated. The NVA regiments that had acted mostly as blocking forces were mauled by American air power. North Vietnam put their losses at 45,000 dead and tens of thousands more wounded. The guerrilla insurgency in the South was over. With the end of the fighting in Hue, the Americans turned their attention to the 6,000 Marines under siege at Khe Sanh. Westmoreland saw a great opportunity. The enemy he had been chasing around the jungle for years, with little success, had virtually committed suicide by attacking the cities. The South Vietnamese army had proven capable of defending the populated areas, freeing up thousands of American troops. The North Vietnamese army units that were making their way back into Laos had been badly bloodied. As he planned to defeat the NVA surrounding the Marines at Khe Sanh, he knew it was time to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail and starve the enemy of their ability to fight. In February, while fighting still raged in Hue, Westmoreland ordered General John J. Tolson, the commander of the 1st Air Cavalry Division, to prepare a contingency plan for the overland relief of Khe Sanh by securing Route 9, then use the combat base as a jump-off point for a hot pursuit of enemy forces into Laos. Tolson was not happy with the assignment, since he believed the best course of action after Tet was to use his division in an attack into the A Sha Valley. Long before the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and the introduction of American troops into South Vietnam, The U.S. Army Special Forces had been raising a mostly ethnic mountain-yard army and constructing remote camps along the border to monitor and interdict North Vietnamese infiltration into the South. The program had grown massively. Most senior Army leaders thought it was out of control. From his 5th Special Forces Group headquarters in Nha Trang, a lowly Army colonel named Jonathan Ladd commanded the equivalent of nearly 4 divisions of civilian irregular defense forces. Prior to the Communist offensive, he was ordered to begin transferring these troops to the Vietnamese Army. Seeing the success of the CIDG troops during Tet, Westmoreland met with Ladd. They discussed the feasibility of redeploying a large portion of Ladd's mountain-yard fighters into Laos. The last piece of Op Plan El Paso to cut the North supply lines had fallen into place. Of course, like anything else in life, there were obstacles in Westmoreland's way. He had requested permission to enter Laos previously, but the State Department had rigidly opposed entering the on-paper-only neutral country, warning that, like in Korea, it might cause Chinese intervention. Their visions of the hordes of communism pouring into Laos was ridiculous. In Korea, the Allies had approached within a few miles of the Chinese border when the attack occurred. The Chinese were hardly going to traverse 500 miles of rugged mountain terrain to attack the Americans in Laos. The other problem was political. Master military tactician and news reporter Walter Cronkite had declared the Tet Offensive a great loss for the Americans and South Vietnamese. The war was unpopular with the American people, and the Johnson administration seemed to be adrift while people died. Westmoreland thought of George Patton's quote from World War II, "I have taken Palermo. What do you want me to do, give it back?" He thought if he could just get a foothold in Laos, the rest of the plan could very well fall into place. Unfortunately, Westmoreland was no George Patton. On 14 March, engineer construction began on a 2,500-foot airstrip and logistics center 6 miles south of the rock pile. 15 days later, it was completed and named LZ Stud. Despite the fact that the commander of the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, General Robert Cushman, was appalled by the implication of a rescue or breaking of the siege by forces other than the Marines, Tolson's 1st Air Cavalry took over the operation. Cushman complained the size of the force was ridiculously large to secure a mere 13 miles of road to the Khe Sanh Combat Base. Tolson's force was indeed impressive, consisting of the entire 1st Air Cavalry Division, augmented by the 1st and 26th Marine Regiments, the Army of the Vietnam's Airborne Task Force, and the 37th Arvin Ranger Battalion. Totaling 30,000 men, it was the largest force ever assembled in the Vietnam War. The rapid completion of LZ Stud and the buildup of forces did not escape the attention of the North Vietnamese. Still reeling from the losses suffered by their Viet Cong main force, General Zapp and the commander of the 559th Group evaluated the situation. Their stores of ammunition had been greatly depleted by the offensive. Many of the regiments, or what was left of them, slowed by transporting casualties, had not yet made their way back into Laos. When their intelligence sources in Hue reported that the 101st Airborne Division was preparing for an operation, there was little doubt. The Americans were coming for Chepong. It was their nightmare scenario. They pored over the old operation plan that intelligence had gathered. If the plan still included a parachute drop southwest of the town, they could inflict heavy casualties with their formidable anti-aircraft weapons. They moved howitzers to the hills west of the city and planted the anti-tank mines they had pre-positioned along Route 9. But in the end, they knew they could not stop the Americans. The best they could hope for was that they would come, destroy what supplies they could find, and leave. Ominously, the plan called for the reconditioning of 2 abandoned airfields, which indicated an extended operation. The North Vietnamese started withdrawing their forces from the Khe Sanh area in the last week of March. Under the command of General Tolson's 1st Air Cavalry Division, the Marines launched Operation Pegasus, the relief of Khe Sanh, at 0700 hours, 1 April 1968. They moved out of Kalu and began clearing Route 9. After a weather delay, the 1st Air Cav secured 3 landing zones, installed 105mm howitzer batteries at each, and began patrolling. With a sky full of helicopters, the process was continually repeated during the operation. Bulldozers and graders resurfaced the road, and temporary bridges were installed by the engineers as they worked to make Route 9 passable. The first major resistance was encountered at the old French fort, south of Route 9 at the Khe Sanh turnoff. Artillery and airstrikes had the situation under control in 24 hours. The Marines launched an attack on Hill 471 out of the combat base, meeting light resistance. However, the NVA attempted to assault their position the next morning, but were driven off by artillery. In one of the most humiliating acts in Marine history, the 1st Air Cavalry Division took command of the Khe Sanh Combat Base on April the 8th. They continued operations around the base until, without warning, on 10 April, General Tolson was ordered to make plans to extract his division as soon as possible to prepare for an assault into the Asha Valley. In Tolson's words, "I had scheduled more than 38 additional operations to extend our control of the Khe Sanh area. There was great potential for the continued air assault operations that were abruptly brought to a close. The enemy was vulnerable, he was abandoning his equipment, and he was completely disorganized." Highway 9 into the Khe Sanh Combat Base was opened on 11 April. 4 days later, Operation Pegasus was officially terminated. When word reached Chapone, the NVA were relieved and bewildered. Why would the Americans assemble such a massive force and not attack? It made no sense. But hey, they'd take it. So what the hell happened? Contemporaries of Westmoreland reported that he should have pushed the case to invade Laos at the Pentagon as forcefully as he did in his book. Colonel Bui Tin, a member of the North Vietnamese General Staff at the time, said that if the Americans would have cut the supply lines in Laos, they would have ended the war. He goes on to say it seemed like the Americans were more interested in continuing the war than winning it. The fight to cut the North supply lines was left to the Air Force and MACV-SOG. 2 million tons of bombs were dropped over Laos, more than all the bombs dropped during World War II. SOG's ground operators suffered the highest sustained casualty rate of any American unit since our Civil War. North Vietnam claimed that those activities resulted in the loss of less than 2% of their supplies. After Operation Pegasus, the war would continue for 5 years at a cost of more than 28,000 American lives. Share your ideas in the comments. You will find my book Dawson's War worthwhile. Rather than just accounts of MACV-SOG's various missions, Dawson's War is the story of 5 men, 3 Americans and 2 Broome Mountain Yard mercenaries. I'll take you with us for a year. You'll get your fair share of gunfights in Laos, because we did. But SOG was so much more than gunfights. SOG was a brotherhood, and unless you experience the camaraderie we shared, you can't really know SOG. Through Dawson's War, these 5 men will become your friends, and like we do, you'll miss them when it's over. In the end, you'll be able to answer SOG's most asked question: what kind of men ran these dangerous missions? Get a copy today at Amazon. Thanks.